Animal Farm by George Orwell. Episode 10. Narrated by Wormhole Podcast. Years passed on Animal Farm. The seasons came and went, and the short lives of animals flickered by like candles in the wind. A time came when almost no one remained who could remember the old days before the rebellion. So many were gone now. Muriel the goat, Bluebell, Jessie, and Pincher the dogs, all had passed on. Even Mr. Jones, the cruel farmer they had overthrown, had died forgotten in a home for drunkards far away. And Boxer, the great workhorse who had given everything for the farm, he was forgotten too, except by the few who had known him. His motto of working harder had carried him all the way to an early grave. Only a handful remembered those early, hopeful days. Old Clover, the mare who had been Boxer's closest friend, was still alive. She was stout now, stiff in her joints, with eyes that had grown dim with age, and perhaps with sorrow. She was 2 years past the age when animals were supposed to retire. But here's the thing. No animal had ever actually retired. That promise, like so many others, had simply been forgotten. Benjamin the donkey was still there, much the same as ever, a little grayer around the muzzle perhaps, and since Boxer's death, even more silent and withdrawn. He was the only one who seemed to remember everything, and he had always known that nothing ever really changed. Many new animals had been born on the farm since the rebellion. To them, the great uprising was just a story passed down by word of mouth, something that had happened long ago. Others had been bought from neighboring farms and had never heard of the rebellion at all. The farm now had 3 young horses besides Clover. They were strong, willing workers and good companions. But they weren't very bright. None of them could learn the alphabet past the letter B. They accepted everything they were told about animalism and the principles of the rebellion. They respected old Clover and listened to her stories with something like wonder. But whether they truly understood any of it, well, that was doubtful. Now, by most measures, the farm was doing quite well. It had grown larger, having bought 2 fields from a neighboring human farmer. The windmill was finally finished, and the farm now owned a threshing machine and other modern equipment. But here's what's interesting about that windmill. Remember how Snowball had dreamed it would generate electricity? How the animals would have heated stalls and running water and only work 3 days a week? None of that had happened. The windmill was used for milling corn. It made money, not miracles. Napoleon had declared that dreaming of luxuries was against the true spirit of animalism. True happiness, Napoleon said, came from hard work and simple living. Of course, this philosophy seemed to apply mainly to the other animals. Somehow, the farm kept getting richer while the animals themselves stayed just as poor. Well, except for the pigs and the dogs. They seemed to be doing quite well for themselves, and there were so many of them now, all with very healthy appetites. Now, the pigs would have you know they worked very hard. Squealer was always explaining how exhausting it was to manage a farm. All those files and reports and memoranda that had to be written. The other animals couldn't possibly understand how difficult it was. And those important documents? As soon as they were finished, they were burned in the furnace. It was all very important work, Squealer assured them, even if no one else could see the point of it. As for the ordinary animals, life went on much as it always had. They were generally hungry. They slept on straw, drank from the pond, and worked in the fields from dawn to dusk. Sometimes the older animals tried to remember, had things been better or worse in the early days? Back when Jones had just been driven out, and everything seemed possible. But it was hard to say. There was nothing to compare their lives to. They only had Squealer's statistics, which always showed things getting better and better. The animals found the problem impossible to solve. And anyway, who had time to think about such things? Only old Benjamin claimed to remember everything. And according to him, things had never been good and never would be. Hunger, hardship, and disappointment were simply the unchangeable facts of life. And yet, despite everything, the animals never lost hope. They never forgot their pride in being part of Animal Farm. This was still the only farm in all of England owned and run by animals themselves. When they heard the gun boom on holidays and saw the green flag flying, their hearts swelled. They would talk about the old heroic days, the battles against the humans, the writing of the 7 Commandments. The dream of Major's Republic of Animals, where humans would never set foot, was still alive. Someday, they believed, that perfect world would come. Maybe not in their lifetimes, but someday. Even the forbidden song, Beasts of England, was still hummed in secret here and there. If they went hungry, at least it wasn't to feed cruel human masters. If they worked hard, at least they worked for themselves. No creature walked on 2 legs, and no one called anyone else master. All animals were equal. That was the fundamental truth they held on to, or so they thought. One day in early summer, something strange happened. Squealer led all the sheep away to a distant corner of the farm. He said he was teaching them a new song, and they needed privacy. The sheep stayed away for an entire week. None of the other animals saw them or knew what they were doing. It seemed odd, but then again, many things on the farm seemed odd these days. Then, one pleasant evening, just as the animals were finishing their work, something happened that changed everything. It started with a sound, a terrified neighing from the farmyard. It was Clover's voice, and she sounded more frightened than anyone had ever heard her. All the animals rushed toward the farmyard. Their hooves and paws pounded against the earth as they ran to see what was wrong. And then they saw what Clover had seen. It was a pig, walking on his hind legs. Squealer was strolling across the yard, upright like a human being. A moment later, more pigs emerged from the farmhouse door. One by one, they walked out on their hind legs. Some were steadier than others, but every single one of them walked upright. And finally, last of all, came Napoleon himself. He walked majestically upright, his small eyes looking down at everyone with cold authority. His dogs ran around him in circles, and in his trotter, he carried a whip. There was a deadly silence across the farmyard. The animals huddled together, terrified and amazed. It felt as though the whole world had turned upside down. For just a moment, it seemed like someone might speak up. After years of silence, of never questioning, of accepting everything, it seemed like the animals might finally say something. But then the sheep burst out bleeding, and what they bleated was terrifying. 4 legs good, 2 legs better. 4 legs good, 2 legs better. They chanted it over and over for 5 solid minutes. And by the time they stopped, the moment for protest had passed, and the pigs had marched back into the farmhouse. In the silence that followed, old Clover nudged Benjamin gently. Without a word, she led him to the end of the big barn, to the wall where the 7 commandments had always been written. "My sight is failing," Clover said quietly. "Even when I was young, I couldn't read what was written there. But Benjamin, that wall looks different. Are the commandments the same as they used to be?" For once in his life, Benjamin agreed to break his own rule of silence. He looked at the wall and read aloud what was written there. There was only 1 commandment now, where once there had been 7. "All animals are equal," Benjamin read. "But some animals are more equal than others." After that, nothing seemed strange anymore. The pigs began carrying whips wherever they went. They bought a radio and subscribed to human magazines and newspapers. Napoleon was seen walking in the farmhouse garden with a pipe in his mouth. The pigs began wearing the old clothes they found in Mr. Jones's wardrobes. Napoleon himself appeared in a black coat and leather leggings. A week later, something unprecedented happened. A group of human farmers arrived at Animal Farm. They had been invited for a tour of inspection. The farmers were shown all around the farm, and they were deeply impressed. They admired the windmill, the organization, the discipline. Meanwhile, the animals worked in the fields, keeping their heads down, not knowing whether to be more afraid of the pigs or the humans. That evening, sounds of laughter and singing came from the farmhouse. For the first time in history, animals and humans were meeting as equals. The curious animals crept toward the farmhouse to see what was happening inside. Led by Clover, they crept into the garden and peered through the dining room window. What they saw would stay with them forever. Around the long table sat 6 farmers and 6 pigs, Napoleon at the head, all perfectly at ease. Mr. Pilkington, one of the neighboring farmers, stood up to give a toast. He said how glad he was that the long period of misunderstanding between their farms was finally over. Once, he admitted, humans had been suspicious of Animal Farm. They had worried that a farm run by animals might spread dangerous ideas. But now, having toured the farm themselves, they were nothing but impressed. The animals here, Pilkington noted with approval, worked harder and ate less than any animals in the county. Then Pilkington made a joke that made everyone roar with laughter. "If you have your lower animals to deal with," he said, "we have our lower classes." The pigs and humans laughed and laughed together at this wonderful joke. Napoleon rose to respond to the toast. He assured the farmers that Animal Farm only wanted peaceful business relations. In fact, he added, the farm was really a cooperative enterprise, owned jointly by the pigs. Napoleon announced several changes to promote better relations with humans. The animals would no longer call each other comrade. The old ceremonies honoring the rebellion would be abolished. And finally, Napoleon had one more announcement. The name Animal Farm had been abolished. From now on, the farm would be known by its original name, the Manor Farm. "Gentlemen," Napoleon concluded, raising his glass. "I give you a toast to the prosperity of the Manor Farm." The humans and pigs drank together, allies at last. As the animals watched through the window, something strange began to happen. They looked at the pigs' faces, trying to understand what had changed. Something seemed to be shifting and transforming in those faces. Clover's dim old eyes moved from face to face, from pig to human, from human to pig. What was it that seemed to be melting and changing? The animals crept quietly away from the farmhouse. They had seen enough. But they hadn't gone far when they heard shouting from inside. They rushed back to look through the window again. Inside, a violent argument had broken out. Fists banged on the table. Accusations flew. Suspicious glances darted back and forth. The cause of the fight became clear. Napoleon and Mr. Pilkington had both played an ace of spades at the same moment. Someone had cheated. 12 angry voices were shouting, and they all sounded exactly the same. The animals outside looked through the window one last time. They looked from pig to man, and from man to pig, and from pig to man again. But already it was impossible to say which was which. And so the story of Animal Farm came to its end. A revolution born from the noblest dreams had become indistinguishable from what it replaced. The pigs, who had promised equality, had become the very masters they once overthrew. Perhaps old Benjamin had been right all along. Perhaps nothing ever really changes, only the names of the masters. But somewhere in the darkness, there might still be animals who remembered the old song. Animals who still believed that someday, somehow, things could be different. That the dream of a world where all creatures truly were equal might still come true. That perhaps the revolution hadn't failed, it simply hadn't been tried honestly yet. Or perhaps that's just another comforting story we tell ourselves. Either way, Manor Farm stands where it always stood, and the windmill keeps turning, grinding corn into profit, just as it always will. This was George Orwell's warning to us all, that every revolution carries within it the seeds of its own betrayal, and that we must always watch very carefully when those who promise to serve us begin to walk on 2 legs.